Hey, everybody. Before we get into the show today, Melvin and I would just like to tell you how you can support the show.
Don't forget to leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes, write a written review, and tell a friend.
You can follow us on social media. We're The Life of X on Facebook and Instagram, and at Life of X Podcast on Twitter. We're definitely the most active on Twitter, so you should join us. Follow us there. Retweet our tweets.
And head over to our support page at lifeofxpodcast.com.
There you are going to find several options to support the podcast. The first is audible.com. For those of you who don't know what audible.com is, it is the largest purveyor of audiobooks on the internet. I have personally been using it for years. Many of the books that we have used for the podcast can be found on Audible. If you go through our portal on our page, you will receive a free audiobook when you sign up for a monthly subscription, and they will also kick us a few dollars.
You can also support us by going through our portal to Amazon. If you do that, any purchases that you make, we'll get a small kickback.
We've also added a featured book page to the website. Any of you who are interested in actually purchasing the books that we've used, many of which are fantastic books, you can go through there, and that will route you through our Amazon portal to the Amazon page where you can purchase the books. And so, again, we get a few cents off each purchase. Additionally, we've set up a Patreon page, and for those of you who are unaware of what that is, it is a service wherein patrons can pledge a certain amount of money per episode. So every time Melvin and I release an episode, you would send us $1, $2, whatever you can. We would appreciate anything. We have goals set up. We have different tiers so that we can also reciprocate your generosity.
All your dollars help.
That's right. But again, we would just like to say that the most important thing that you can do is rate, review, and tell a friend. Help get our name out there. All right. Enjoy the show.
Thanks, guys. Hello, everyone out there. Just want to let you know about an excellent opportunity for you to win a $25 Amazon gift card.
And support the Life of X at the same time. We are going to be running a Twitter contest this week. If you are listening to this on the day that it was released, Wednesday, the 24th of October of the year 2018. If you go over to our Twitter page, we are at the Life of X Podcast. There will be a pinned tweet on our profile. If you like, retweet, and then follow us on Twitter, you'll be entered into a contest that ends on Friday the 26th for a $25 Amazon gift card. So just head over to our Twitter page, like and retweet the pinned tweet, and make sure that you follow us. And at the end of the day on Friday, we will randomly select someone. We'll reach out to you on Twitter, and we will get you that $25 gift card. All right, enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Arif Jadala.
And I'm Melvin Barnes.
And that makes this the Life of X. Melvin, how are you?
I'm good. Life's good. I can't complain.
Yeah. Any news to catch up on in the past month or so?
Pretty soon here we're going to be heading back to China to do more action-packed research. Beijing, Shanghai.
That's exciting. You've also been given the gift of sight.
Yeah, I've been given the gift of sight. I went and got my eyes lasered, so now I can see with probably better than 20/20 vision. I can see into the future.
That's wonderful. Happy for you. So anyway, who do we got today?
Today we have the man, the myth, the legend, Steve Jobs.
Man, I have a lot to say about Steve Jobs.
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting episode. Love him or hate him. Well, we're going to find out who hates him.
I don't hate him. I think very
differently
than I did. And I think, this would probably come up at some point, but I just feel like when we deal with these biographies, like we pick these people who we're interested in, many of whom we really like, and you're forced to confront the fact that they're just regular people with lots of flaws in many cases. I just feel like with Dwight, I had this sterling vision of him as a great war leader and, a man of high integrity. And you find out he just ran around with his wife all the time. That hurt me a little.
Hurt you a little? Were you like, Dwight, no?
Yeah. And then not that I thought that Steve Jobs was some saint or paragon of morality or anything like that, but man, let me down a little. Looking at my iPhone a little different.
The screen ain't as bright as it used to be, Pop.
That's right. But anyway, we should get right down to it.
Let's get in it.
Stephen Paul Jobs was born on February 24th, 1955, but he was not originally given that name because he was not born to the Jobs family. He was born to Joanne Schiebel and Abdul Fattah John Jandali, a Muslim teaching assistant at the University of Wisconsin, where Joanne was also attending school. Both of his parents came from relatively well-off families. Joanne's was from a wealthier family in Wisconsin. I'm just going to call him John instead of having to say a 3-syllable name every time. John was born in Syria, and his family's quite wealthy there, and both families had a huge emphasis on education for their children. And so John, even though he was a Muslim, was sent to a Jesuit boarding school when he was, of school age, and then sent on to pursue his doctorate in the U.S., which is where he met Joanne, who was studying at Wisconsin as well. And, I don't know if it was just the times or what it was, but Joanne's parents were less than thrilled about her falling in love with a Muslim man. And so their relationship it wasn't a secret, but it wasn't, they weren't open. They probably would have been married sooner than they were if her parents had been less closed off to the idea. But she traveled to Syria with him, and while there, meeting the family, they loved her, that sort of thing, and she got pregnant, and that baby was Steve. But again, circling back to Joanne's parents, her father pretty much said, if you marry this Muslim, I'm going to disown you. And so they did not get married, and she entered into the care of this doctor in San Francisco who was sort of known for taking care of unwed mothers and arranging private adoptions and, delivering their babies and kind of coordinating. So that's what she did. And she had the baby. She had one major stipulation that her child had to be adopted by college graduates because she was highly educated. Her will-be husband is also highly educated. They both had a high value on education, and they wanted that for their child, even though they weren't going to be raising him. That's not exactly what happened.
Yeah, so enter Paul Reinhold Jobs and Clara, maiden name, Hagapian?
I would say like Hagapian, maybe. I don't know.
That sounds like something from a Lord of the Rings movie.
Whatever.
Yeah, she would soon become Jobs. So, yeah, they were not college graduates. Paul actually wasn't even a high school graduate. He dropped out of high school and just kind of wandered the Midwest. He was from Germantown, Wisconsin. Eventually, he ends up serving in World War II on the USS General M.C. Meigs, and he spent the war effort ferrying troops in Italy during World War II. Now, when he comes back, he's docked in San Francisco, and this is where he meets Clara.
He was so handsome.
Strikingly
handsome. I don't think, again, this is just a running theme, so I don't even feel the need to apologize anymore, but we keep forgetting to mention the book that we're basing this off of.
Yes.
And it is Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, and it's fantastic. You should all read it. But in it, it's just funny because Isaacson is very descriptive, and he describes Paul as like looking like James Dean or something like that.
Classically handsome.
Super hot.
Okay, well, this makes sense because Paul and Clara are engaged within 2 weeks.
Yeah, well, Paul made a bet. And he had to make good on that bet. He bet his crewmates. He said, listen, I'm going to be married real quick. I forget the exact amount of time, but it was real quick. And, with Clara, she had actually already been married once, and her husband had died in the war. And she was looking to get married again, pretty much, and she just happened to find Paul and
find herself a handsome sailor.
That's right. I mean, James Dean doesn't just walk off a boat and you let him walk away.
Right. And, it's 1950s. It worked out. It moved a little faster back then. Life was a little quicker.
Yeah. And it worked out. They were happily married.
So fast forward to 1955. They're living in the Sunset District of San Francisco, and, they're looking to start a family. But unfortunately for the Jobses?
That's a struggle. I'm going to go with Jobs.
I like Jobses. Jobses.
There's too many S's, I think.
All right, Jobs. For the Jobs,
the Jobs
Clara
family
suffered an ectopic pregnancy. And I'm going to let Arif kind of explain this a little more.
Why?
I don't know. Your wife's a PA.
I didn't go to school for that.
Okay, so what happens with an ectopic pregnancy is the fertilized egg actually becomes attached to the fallopian tube instead of the uterus. And because of this left Clara unable to become pregnant. So by 1955, the Jobs are looking to adopt. That's how they end up running into Steve.
Yeah, and also they weren't the first people, obviously, who were contacted because she wanted educated folks, and they weren't. So initially, Steve was supposed to go to a lawyer and his wife.
Yeah, but he was a boy.
Yeah, and they wanted a girl. So I don't know. Does it take like a cold-hearted person to look at a baby that needs a home and say, "Nah, I'm good.
This isn't the baby we're looking for.
This is not the baby you were looking for.
Can you bring me a newer model?"
Yeah, but anyway, that's more or less what happened. So the doctor who was, helping Joanne found the jobs, and they ended up with Steve.
And how did this play out, Eric?
Well, it played out happily ever after, just like you would expect it to.
Except it didn't.
Yeah, except it didn't. Joanne, her extra closed-minded dad was about to die, and her and John were planning on getting married after he did. So in the back of her mind, if she could just stall this adoption maybe long enough for them to get married, she and John could just keep the baby. So she, threw a fit about Steve not going into a home of educated people, and so she refused to sign the adoption papers even after baby Steve was actually living with Paul and Clara. But eventually she did, and they just...
Yeah, it's important to point out, this is obviously a very human reaction, and, she's a tough situation. And she eventually did sign the papers, but one of her stipulations was that the family, the Jobses, had to establish a college fund for Steve, which we'll get into later in the pod.
So Paul and Clara agreed to fund this college fund happily. Unlike the cold-hearted lawyer and his wife, they were thrilled to be getting Steve. They absolutely adored him. And one thing about it was they never shied away from the fact that he was adopted. He always knew that they weren't his birth parents, but, he was always made to feel like he was special. It wasn't that like, oh, your birth parents didn't want you. It was more reframed by Paul and Clara that we could have adopted any child that we wanted, but we chose you because you're special. And they really instilled that in him, and that is something that stayed with him his entire life. Also, in the book, Isaacson talks to a lot of people who knew Steve. Obviously, it's an extremely well-researched book, and they all talk about how Steve had this abandonment complex, that like the idea that his birth parents quote unquote abandoned him really stuck with him, and I don't know if scarred is the right word, but it definitely shaped the way that he looked at the world. Isaacson, in his interviews with Steve never really thought much of that. He said that he never felt that he was abandoned, that only that he was special. So I mean, take that for what you will. I don't know how much Steve would have been willing to say on that, but that was the case. Anyway, honestly, the way that Isaacson describes Jobs' early childhood, it sounds like an episode of the Brady Bunch to me. They're in this neighborhood with like all the houses that look, cookie cutter, and everybody's happy. And they're in California at a time where that's where all the engineers were going. And so they live in this like normal suburb, but everyone was an engineer.
Yeah, probably the greatest concentration of engineers in the United States.
They were all going to work at HP and all these other
IBM.
places. I mean, this is like right before it became Silicon Valley. You know what I mean? It's like this was the making of Silicon Valley.
The foundation. This is bottom floor Silicon Valley.
That's right. And it's really funny because there's one aside that he points to, and he's like, even the dregs of society, quote unquote, in this neighborhood were also engineers. He talks about this one guy who was like a drunk who beat up his girlfriend and that sort of stuff. But instead of being like the homeless guy down the road, like he was also just an HP engineer. Everyone was an engineer in this neighborhood. And that obviously influenced Steve quite a bit. Paul, his father, was not an engineer, but he was an extremely handy guy. He was also a very accomplished craftsman, and he really instilled in Steve, whenever they would do these little projects and stuff like that together, is like that everything should be done correctly. Every piece of anything that we build needs to be beautiful, whether it is visible or not. So he spent just as much time doing parts of a fence. The part of the fence that you wouldn't even see because it would be covered up by the fence post, it was going to be just as well painted as every other part of it. And that's just something he believed in, and that's something that really stuck with Steve. You'll see as we go forward when he starts building his own products or being in charge of design and that sort of stuff for Apple. And Paul, like we said, was not an engineer, but he was good enough with electronics to teach Steve some basics. But again, he was more into like the automotive and stuff, and Steve was never really into that. But Steve just idolized his dad, and so even though he wasn't interested, he would stick around and learn these things from his dad, again, regardless of the fact that he didn't actually care. He just wanted to be around his dad.
Yeah, so I mean, I think small children a lot of times they idolize their father figures, especially males. And there was a day when, Steve had to realize that Paul didn't know everything.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly,
we've all been there.
Yeah. I mean, and it is weird. It is weird to like that moment when you realize like, oh, wait, like my dad or my mom is not like this supreme source of wisdom.
This godlike being.
Yeah.
So one day, with everyone in the neighborhood being these engineers working in, all these various companies around California, they had a neighbor named Larry Lang, and he taught Steve about carbon microphones. And on this day, he demonstrated something to Steve that showed him that you could use the carbon microphone, but without an amplifier. Steve, he runs home to Paul and he's like, hey, Dad, check this out. Like, you don't need the amplifier. And obviously, Paul, being the handy guy that he is, but he's not necessarily on the cutting edge of technology, he's sitting there saying like, no, look, son, son, you need to have an amplifier. Trust me. Now, he doesn't necessarily believe what Steve has just seen. So Steve, being a typical kid, drags his father
as heck.
right, drags his father all the way over to the Lang's house, where he then demonstrates the carbon microphone again. And Paul has to say like, well, I'll be. This works. And that was for Steve, it was an important moment. It's kind of the start of where he starts to realize my parents don't know everything, and I'm pretty smart.
Yeah, and it's funny too because Isaacson does a really good job of portraying this as kind of like a dramatic moment for Steve. But at the same time, it probably didn't even cross Paul's mind. He was probably just like, oh yeah, I was wrong. Like he seems like a very like down to earth, humble person who would have no trouble with just being like, oh.
Sometimes I'm wrong.
Right. But like for Steve, I imagine it like the world is ending for him. And then, like you said, he starts to realize my parents aren't always right. And then shortly after this, he starts to realize that he's smarter than his parents.
And
real young. And he was very, very intelligent. And he felt really shameful about thinking that at first, but then he kind of accepted it and then let it go to his head.
Oh yeah. So when he starts school, he's how would you say, Arif? A little all over the place?
Petulant is my favorite adjective for Steve Jobs. So extremely intelligent, and this is not an uncommon thing with kids who are above the average intelligence of someone their age. When they get to school and they have to do these exercises that are too easy for them, a lot of times they act out because they're bored. Yeah. Clara had taught Steve how to read before he even started school, so he was already ahead of the curve, and he was smarter than all of his classmates. But he wasn't great at just sitting around and doing all these exercises or whatever. He wanted to do other stuff, and so he would act out and was always in trouble.
But the crazy thing is the Jobs, they tended to take his side.
They always took his side,
which is wild because, like, I'm thinking about my childhood and like I was always wrong. Like, if the teacher said I did something wrong, like my parents were like,
game over.
Yeah, like what? Melvin did what? Yeah, so the Jobs, their child was special, and they treated him as such.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, he was extremely intelligent. But at the same time, discipline your child.
Right.
The Jobses. But anyway, all of this continued up until Jobs was in 4th grade. And he really met someone who he called a saint in these interviews with Isaacson. It was Imogen Teddy Hill. And she was fantastic. She shared the Jobs view that Steve was special and that he was very intelligent, and him acting out in school wasn't just because he was a quote-unquote bad kid. It was because he needed to be challenged. And so
I'm sure the Jobs loved that explanation.
Oh, for sure. And so she started sending him home with extra work to do, but also she would say, like, I'm going to give you this gigantic lollipop and $5 if you get all these high school level math questions done to me in like a week. So he jumped at that and absolutely.
But eventually the lollipops weren't enough, right?
Well, no, actually, eventually he didn't even want the lollipops anymore or the money. He just wanted to do the problems. Like, he just wanted to be challenged. She really woke up this drive and this thirst for knowledge in Steve.
Yeah, and she's the driving force behind kind of getting him tested to see where he sits in terms of, what grade he's supposed to be in. And I mean, at the time he's in the 4th grade.
4th grade, and after she had realized all this great stuff about him, she ends up giving him this grinding set or whatever for these lenses that he absolutely loved for like microscopes or something like that, I believe. But then she was like, yeah, like we need to get his IQ tested. And so he tests at a 10th grade level in 4th grade. And so the school wanted to jump him up to 7th grade, which would have been
2 grades.
2 grades. And his parents, probably wisely chose to just have him skip 1. So he was on to middle school.
So the school that was in the Jobs school district wasn't great.
Wasn't awesome.
The school's name was Crittenden, and Steve was we're not even going to say mildly. He was a socially awkward child.
Yeah.
He was extremely intelligent and probably a little bit sheltered.
I mean, just think of any kid that lived his whole life being told he was special. I'm sure that would be an annoying little kid.
Right. So he shows up at Crittenden, smaller than everyone else, having skipped a grade. And
Crittenden sounds like prison, by the way.
Right. And it doesn't help that Crittenden it was a school that had a lot of gang violence. That's the best way to put it.
Yeah,
so,
no, it seriously sounds like prison. Like, it sounds like Steve should have found the biggest dude on the first day and just
knocked him out.
Smashed his nose with a lunch tray or something.
Right. So you've got, imagine the intellectual Steve Jobs being dropped into the gladiator training camp known as Crittenden Middle School. And obviously, things did not go well. So, I mean, while he's there, he was bullied mercilessly.
Yeah.
And, it was so bad that Steve gets to the point where he goes back home and he says, listen, I'm not going to mince any words here. I'm not going back to that school. And the Jobs, being the parents that they are, they say, you know what? We can do something about this. So what any parent would do, Eric is shaking his head.
Sell the house. I can't tell. Here's the thing. On one hand, I think that Claire and Paul were fantastic parents, that they just loved the crap out of their son enough that they were willing to sacrifice anything for him. But at the same time, I'm were they just pushovers?
There's a thin line between loving and enabling.
Yeah, and another thing, and we didn't mention her because, not that she's not important, but she and Jobs were never particularly close. The Jobses also adopted a daughter. So Steve had a little sister, and I'm like, were they making these sort of concessions for her too? What's going on?
Well, I mean, one thing that, look, in full disclosure, we don't have kids.
No, we don't.
Not yet,
dogs.
at least.
I got dogs.
We got dogs. And you do a lot for the dogs.
I do. I would sell my house for the dogs.
So just let that be known that we don't have any kids. But yeah, they moved into the Los Altos school district.
It was I believe it was the Cupertino Sunnyvale school district.
Much nicer.
Yeah.
The name sounds a lot nicer.
Actually, it was only 3 miles away from the house that they previously lived in, but it was
just over the line.
Yeah, but it was such a stark difference. It was from one of the worst in terms of violence and that sort of thing, school districts, into one of the top in the valley.
Isn't it crazy how that happens?
We get in a whole different discussion about why that happens.
We'll do a pod on redlining or something like that.
Yeah, we'll just do a whole different podcast.
All right, well, on to the new school.
Yeah, so he goes to Cupertino, living the dream, doing well. He fit in a lot better there. Not that he was, a social butterfly once he got there, but he wasn't getting his butt kicked every day at school. So that was good. And then, he stays in that school district for the rest of his time. And when he gets to high school, he kind of falls into what Isaacson refers to as the geek counterculture. And, we mentioned before that this area that he was growing up in was big on computers, and obviously it became Silicon Valley. And so everyone was into computers, and everyone was, well, not everyone, but a lot of people were into engineering and that sort of stuff too. And so Steve quickly found himself really engaged in the electronics and stuff. But another aspect of this counterculture was they were really into LSD.
This was the heyday, man.
It was.
This was the heyday of that geek culture.
It was. And it wasn't just LSD. It was also weed and that sort of stuff too. But Jobs fell in with a group of older students, and they took him under his wing, under their wing, and
showed him the engineering and geek ropes.
Yeah, and showed him how to expand that consciousness. And he was really into that sort of thing. Steve takes on
a little MDMA will help you open up your mind.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was just really into the idea of different states of consciousness, and so different ways of getting there. And so drugs were one, and he got really into fasting and sleep deprivation. And Steve takes on a bunch of really weird, quote unquote. Yeah. I'm not here to judge.
We're gonna get into the wildness.
Yeah, but he, that's something that he does through adulthood. And
kind of comes back to bite him in the end, though.
It sure does. Might have killed him. But this is where it kind of starts, is with this falling into the geek counterculture. And so he's into, drugs, into electronics and all that sort of thing.
And one of these older students that he's running with, and I would say, I think it's fair to say that this guy kind of becomes his best friend.
Definitely for a while at least.
Yeah, is the other Steve Wozniak. So we've got the Steves. Now, Steve Wozniak is, he's the son of a brilliant engineer, but they're kind of like polar opposites in terms of personalities.
Yeah, and, he was older, and he met Steve because Steve was actually in school with his younger brother, but Woz always hung out with the younger guys because he was kind of like,
A little awkward too.
yeah, kind of awkward and like socially and emotionally immature.
Just
Steve,
worked out better hanging out with the younger kids.
yeah, Steve had that arrogant old soul, so they kind of like met in the middle.
Yeah. And where, Steve could kind of be impetuous and really not take into account other people's feelings, Woz was
Complete opposite.
very sensitive, very kind.
Very honest.
Yeah, very honest. So it's kind of amazing that these two came together.
It was like opposites attract.
Yeah.
Kind of like me and you, Melvin. I'm really a great guy, and you're kind of a dirtbag.
Yeah, so based on that statement, we know where we fall. So yeah, the way that they really kind of, I guess, what would we call this, a defining moment for the two of them, the blue boxes?
Well, so, they were friends, and they would just talk and hang out, and Jobs really respected Woz because, as brilliant as he thought himself, he recognized quickly that Wozniak was an electronics like sorcerer.
Yeah, some real witchcraft.
Yeah, he was like, Woz for sure is better than me at this stuff. He's like, I'm maybe top whatever percentile in electronics among my peers, but Woz is like a whole step above
And
us.
given even the level of arrogance that Steve had kind of acquired by this point in time, how much better did Woz have to be for him to have that sort of realization?
The thing that's crazy, and we'll definitely dig into this more, but Woz more or less at least played a very large role in what we consider personal computing as it is today. The man was a genius, like certifiable computer and technological genius. And I think it would be hard for anyone to deny that. And Jobs definitely recognized it. So they got along and they enjoyed hanging out, working on different electronic stuff together. They both shared a love for Bob Dylan and that sort of thing. And so they were hanging out. And one day, actually right before Wozniak was due to head back to college, he came across this article in Esquire about
phone freakers.
Yeah, phone freakers, and I forget what the other term was, but it was about how hackers and phone freakers had found a way to make long-distance phone calls free of charge, which is hilarious to think of now in 2018. That, like, I mean, I remember when long distance.
Oh yeah, it was a thing. You get that. This is a collect call.
Yeah, or like even that. My mom would be like, if I was going to call someone who was like farther away, like, you have to, make sure you're not on there long. That's an expensive call, like this and that. And I remember especially because my dad, whenever he would call back home to his family in the Middle East, it was like, got to get off the phone real quick. But the whole idea behind these little blue boxes was that there's a set of tones that routes your call, and that also has to do with how they charge you. And these people had found a way to mimic the tones to where they wanted to call, and so no one got charged. So Wozniak reads this article and he immediately calls Jobs and he's like, we can totally do this. And
it's also important to note that the kind of technical specs, basically what they needed to do, the tone that they needed to mimic, could be found in the Bell Systems Technical Journal.
Right.
So once AT&T realizes this, AT&T's like, we need to get these journals out of these libraries.
Yeah.
So obviously these journals are being pulled off the shelves at a ridiculous rate. But luckily for Steve, their local library had a copy. But did they go in during the day and check the book out?
Nope.
No, absolutely not.
They broke in and stole it.
What would geeks at this time do?
They would break in.
Break in the middle of the night.
To steal a technical journal. That's my favorite part.
Right.
Criminals.
It's like, what crime did you commit, man?
What are you in for?
No, man, I stole the Bell System Technical Journal.
But anyway, that's what they did. And they had also both been members of this kind of like after school group that HP had been running called the Explorers Club. And it was just kind of like a forum for these HP engineers to go out and talk to kids about, what they were working on at HP, which HP at the time was, and that's Hewlett Packard, was cutting edge. And then they got to kind of work on these little projects and stuff there. And Jobs had done a frequency counter for one of his projects there. And so they got the idea that they could use the frequency counter to mimic the dial tone that they needed for the blue box. And they also realized that this was a larger project than they could throw together right now before Wozniak went back to school. So he was like, give me this frequency counter. Give me this stolen technical journal. Right. I'm going to go back to Berkeley and I'm going to have this done by Thanksgiving. And not only did he have it done by Thanksgiving, he also made the first ever digital version. Like, this had all been manual before. Yeah.
Sorcery.
And, I mean, really, though, like, he was a genius.
And my understanding of the box itself is this is something that you attach to the phone itself when you go to, dial out. And then magically, you're able to make these long-distance phone calls for free. And they produced this digital blue box and they test it out. Obviously, who do they try to call?
Well, I love that like the first thing that they did, I think they were trying to call one of the Steve's uncles the first time.
Yeah,
and they
totally.
got
How do you botch that? You just built the first ever digital blue box and you can't even get the number right to call your uncle.
But they got somebody in California. And it was really funny because Isaacson describes it. They get whoever answers the phone, and he's also in California, whoever's on the other line, and they're freaking out. They're so excited, like, we're calling for free. We're calling for free.
Wasn't even a long distance call.
Well, I mean, it might have been technically a long distance call, but then Steve gets on the phone. He's like, we're in California. And the guy was probably like, I am also in California.
In California, yeah.
Right. But they work out the bugs or whatever. And eventually they
move on to bigger and badder pranks.
Bigger and badder pranks where they try to call the Pope.
Got pretty close. As Henry Kissinger.
As Henry Kissinger. They got as far as his translator before I think they were found out, or maybe they abandoned or what it was. But one of the things about the blue box was that it was the first time that the two of them kind of came together in this way that would become Apple. And that was that Wozniak would do something genius, and then Steve had the vision to see how this could be marketed and profited from.
So it's kind of important to point out that in that culture that sprout up during that time, that there was that kind of hacker mentality. So it was like when you produce something that was of value, you didn't hoard it or keep it to yourself. You actually were kind of expected to share the ideas and things like that, which we'll get into more later. But I think this is one of the first times that Jobs starts to see we can kind of make money off of this.
Yeah, and so they start by taking it to different college dorms and stuff like that, and they would just get a group around them, and they would demo, and they would call like dial-a-joke services in Australia or like people in different countries and be like, listen, you too can do this, or just make free long-distance calls. And they were selling for like $150 and selling quite a bit of them. And that all came to a close when Jobs, who had arranged to sell one to someone, met the guy to make the sale, and the guy pulls out a gun and he's like, I'm going to take this. But it was weird because it wasn't just like, I'm going to take this and that's it. He still gave Steve Jobs his number and he was like, I'm going to call you if anything goes wrong with it. And he did. And then Steve considered going and trying to like walk him through it to see if he can get his money.
Jeez.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't, but I was like, why would you even think that? If someone pulled a gun on me, I would try my best to never see that person again.
So the robbery basically brought an end to the blue box business that they had been working on.
Yeah, but I mean, again, the importance of it, and both Steves recognized this and talk about it in Isaacson's book, was that like without the blue box, there may have never been an Apple, because it really set up the dynamic between the two of them that, Woz will make the crazy creations and Steve can sell them.
Sell it, market it, make it work. And before we move on to Steve's time in college, it's important to point out just kind of how, by this point in time, out there Steve had become.
Yeah, if you're thinking like normal high school, like
out there,
senior,
like I'm into black and death metal or something like that. That's not what we're talking about.
No, not at all. He was a different guy. Yeah,
so Steve would experiment with just these wild diets, he would go weeks on end where he would just eat one thing.
Yeah, he was really into these strange diets where he would also, again, this kind of circles back to this whole idea of like messing with his consciousness, trying to attain different states, and he would just not eat for long periods of time, or then when he did, it was like
only carrots,
or
and then, only apples.
Yeah, and he was just like a different guy. Like he had like shoulder length hair, and like he mastered this weird technique of just being able to stare at people for like minutes at a time without blinking.
And he also took to traveling around barefoot.
Yeah, but he also so we have those things, and then also he would do this thing where he would intentionally speak in a cadence where he would just like long periods of uncomfortable silence follow these like bursts
of just rapid fire
speaking and staring. And he also he reveled in being a different guy, and it kind of worked for him in terms of hooking Chris Ann. So he gets his girlfriend in high school is where they met, and from all descriptions, she was way out of Jobs' league. It would be like, imagine
me dating Halle Berry.
We could go there. That's kind of what it sounds like based on Isaacson's description. But she was kind of into that. He was weird and intense and that sort of thing. And, Steve really liked her too, but he was always And this is sort of just a trademark Steve Jobs move, but he was always kind of cold and aloof. And she was really, really into him. And, when they were done with high school, they got this cabin.
Love shack.
Yeah, I don't know what it is with our podcast topics and having love shacks, but they had one. I don't know where they had money from or, what really the details were, but they kind of lived together in this cabin right after Steve graduated from high school. And I believe that she was like a year younger or something like that. So she was still in high school, but that summer they lived together. And Steve, again, was loving sometimes, but like also a very like cold and intense person. And he could really be mean and harsh. But overall, it sounds like Love Shack summer was a good time. She pretty much just painted and Steve played guitar and did his electronic stuff. And that's what they did. And then it was time for college.
So, at this point in time, Steve, he's done with high school. He's got to transition out into college.
And real quick, he had the biggest ego ever by this point.
Naturally.
I just feel like it's very important to highlight the fact that he thought he was above everybody by this point in his life.
Yeah, so Jobs is, he's doing the thing that typical high school graduates are doing. He's searching around, where am I going to go to school? And the Jobs they're prepared to send him to school pretty much anywhere in the state of California.
But they're not wealthy people.
Right. They'd done well on they'd made well on the promise that they had made, and they were ready to, to fund his college so long as he stayed in state. Now, Steve had a lot of options. He could have gone to Stanford
or
Berkeley.
Yeah, I mean, he could have gone to plenty of other state schools that probably would have given him scholarships to go, and the Jobses wouldn't have had to pay a dime.
And honestly, why would you want to go to a school like Stanford?
Yeah,
I mean, not very good on academics.
What is it, like junior college or something?
Yeah, I don't know. So where does Steve decide? He says, okay, yeah, sure, I'll go to college, but I'm only going to one college, Reed College,
which was extremely expensive,
and in Portland, Oregon. So basically, he's looking at the Jobs and saying, like, I know y'all got a little bit of money, but I'm going to need all of it and some because I'm going to Reed. And they pleaded with him. They begged him not to go. But, once he had made it up in his mind that that's where he wanted to go, that's where he was going to go. And I think some of the ideas he had about the college really kind of meshed and fit with where he wanted to go. It had a reputation for being kind of, I don't know, like what would you call it, hippie haven?
Yeah, it absolutely did. But it also had a reputation for being extremely academically rigorous, which he apparently just chose to ignore that part of its reputation.
I missed that part in the brochure.
Yeah, I mean, it was an extremely rigorous college, and they were
it's a good school.
I don't know anything about it now, but I mean, I'm sure it's probably still a great school, but like it was a fantastic school then, and it was very difficult, and it was a very challenging liberal arts school.
And he was shocked when he found out they had mandatory courses.
Yeah.
Like courses you had to take, like actual coursework.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in a second. I just want to make sure we don't skip over the fact that just speaks more to the kind of petulant, again, my favorite adjective for Steve Jobs, was his parents, after begging him to go somewhere else, they give in, as they did, and they are taking him to Reed, and he wouldn't even let them drop him off on campus. Like, he didn't want to be seen with his parents. He didn't even say goodbye to him. He just got out of the car and walked the rest of the way on campus. And, according to Isaacson, Jobs always regretted that, later in his life, but I don't know. I just feel like he consistently, as a young man, acted like a real jerk. And I don't know, you can feel as bad about it later in life as you want, but it didn't change the fact that he was a jerk to his parents who had never done anything but love and enable him and do their best to make sure he had the best that they could give him. But he had this idea in his head that, he wanted to be this mysterious wanderer who had just been like hopping trains like a hobo or whatever all around the country.
That's the strangest thing that I like. So let me get this straight. You're a mysterious wanderer hopping on and off trains across the country, and then you somehow happen to stumble onto the cash to attend Reed College.
Yeah. I mean, he just had this weird narrative in his head that he was trying to live up to, and he did so at the expense of his parents. So Jobs arrives at Reed under these strange circumstances. The nomadic wanderer.
Blown into town.
Yeah. And, we've talked about Reed and how it was a rigorous academic institution and that sort of thing, but it was also very small, especially for a university standard. There was only like 500 students there. people kind of knew everybody. Professors were very involved in people's lives and that sort of thing. And it had this hippie culture. And by this time, like, the war in Vietnam was dying down. And so it was less about this like student activism, about like anti-war protests and that sort of thing. And a lot of people had turned to seeking fulfillment through different routes. And one way that a lot of people at Reed was like Zen Buddhism. And Jobs threw himself into Zen, which is sort of like an oxymoron in my mind just because of how intense he was. But he got really into meditation, and, he really dove headfirst into some principles of it, such as, meditation and reflection and minimalism especially, which is something that stuck with him throughout his entire life. And then he became a vegetarian, but, can't just be a regular vegetarian. Had to take it to the next level.
Straight carrots, homie.
Straight carrots, homie. Or just apples. Or, he, just like everything in his life, he was extremely intense in these sort of things. And he was living the dream. And one of his roommates, I believe it was his first roommate at Reed, was Daniel Kotke. And he was East Coast guy, came from an affluent family, was also into Zen and acid and Bob Dylan. So him and Jobs were like two peas in a pod, except Isaacson describes him as a sweet flower child. And so, like, in my mind, he's like East Coast Wozniak. That is just another opposite of Jobs that have some shared interests. But they were friends, and they would remain friends for a while. And it was kind of like Jobs and Daniel's girlfriend, Elizabeth Holmes. They were three musketeers, and they would hang out all the time and drop acid and meditate and talk about Zen and walk around barefoot and go eat vegetables. And that was their deal.
On top of that, Jobs also ran into another figure named Robert Friedland.
I think Kotke introduced them. Oh, no, he didn't.
Well, yeah, this was a weird way that they met.
This is a strange way to meet someone.
Yeah, I can't remember for what reason.
Jobs was selling his, I think it was like a calculator or something like that to him.
Ah, yes. And he walks into this guy, Robert Friedland's room, only to discover that he's in there having sex with his girlfriend. And obviously, Steve does what any normal human being would do and says, like, hey, you know what, man? I'll come back later. Just let me know when to come back. And Friedland says, hey, man, why don't you take a seat on the couch and just wait?
We'll be done in a moment.
Yeah, just wait for us to finish, man. And I guess that's what Jobs did. So that's how the two met. Now, Robert was the son of a survivor from Auschwitz. And he also, strangely enough, was a little bit older at this point in time because he'd been locked up, the 2 years prior, because he had been caught selling apparently $125,000 worth of LSD. Jesus, that's a lot of LSD.
Yeah.
So he got locked up. And what when you show up on a college campus after being locked up for selling drugs, naturally, what happens to you?
You run for student body president and win in a landslide.
Man, 70s.
Yeah, I mean, Friedland was an extremely charismatic person. He was also really into Zen. He had, some of you may have heard of the book Be Here Now by Baba Ram Dass. He's kind of I don't know, he's a big name, I guess, in some circles. He had studied under Maharaji, and the two of them both shared an interest in this book in particular. Be Here Now also is a lot about psychedelic use and that sort of thing too, not just Zen Buddhism, and so they kind of connected over that. But Jobs really took to Friedland and kind of viewed him as a mentor. He really admired the fact that Friedland had actually traveled to India and studied under Maharaji himself and had met Ram Dass and all this sort of stuff. So Jobs was kind of taken and infatuated by this super charismatic guy, and that charisma really rubbed off on Jobs the more time they spent together, and they spent a lot of time together. Friedland had
220 acres of apple farm, baby.
Yeah, and it was like, I guess he had like some very wealthy and eclectic uncle who like lived in Switzerland or something like that. And again, like Friedland's family was also very wealthy. I feel like if you were at Reed, your family was wealthy, just in general. But so Friedland's very wealthy and eclectic uncle from Sweden or wherever had this 220 acre apple farm that Friedland was.
I mean, he seemed to paint it as a sort of co-op.
Yeah, I mean, he was like charged with like looking over it while he was at Reed, and so he kind of turned it into a commune of sorts for vegetarians and other Zen Buddhist practitioners.
Yeah, and they used to spend a lot of time
picking
apples, pruning the trees.
Meditating.
And I think obviously the two of them were close, but at a certain point, Jobs kind of realized that people are kind of being used as a labor source out here on the apple orchard.
Yeah, so like Jobs was really infatuated with Friedland, like we said initially, but then he sort of fell out of love with him when he like realized that Friedland was selling these apples and like no one else was getting paid. And they were preaching this message of everything that they do should belong to the community and that sort of stuff. And Jobs recalls one particular instance where he's like asleep on the kitchen floor or whatever, because like they just packed people into the house at this place, and people kept like coming to the food storage area or whatever and like stealing it for themselves. And he was like, "Oh, this is like not what I signed up for. Like I'm here for the morality and the sharing, and everyone here is materialistic and that sort of thing." And he started to think of Friedland the same way.
So Jobs ends up being a little disillusioned with his buddy, and he also ends up a little disillusioned with school. He stops attending class and eventually drops out altogether. Obviously, the structured school platform wasn't for him, but
he was really into learning. He just wasn't into learning what they wanted him to learn.
Exactly. So now when I say drop out, I'm gonna put the air quotes up here because he was no longer officially enrolled in classes. But
Reed's idea of dropping out was real different.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a smaller school. He knows everyone, and basically he works out a scenario where it's like, sure, you can audit some classes. Oh yeah, we'll let you like stay in the dorms with a couple of your friends. That's fine. That's fine. So basically, he's still going to classes. Just now, it's the classes he wants to go to. And he's not paying for anything.
Yeah, sounds ideal.
Yeah, like, can't we all drop out that way? I need to get educated.
I need this free education.
I need the full education minus all the other rigorous stuff.
Yeah, all the stuff I'm not actually interested in learning.
Because I don't need the diploma at the end of the day. I just need the knowledge, man. I
just need the knowledge. But so he starts getting to take these classes that he likes, some dance classes. He was interested in meeting women because at this point he was still kind of with Chris Ann. She would come down and hang out at Friedland's farm, which was called like the All One Farm or something like that. And they would hang out and still be on again, off again. But Jobs, he was looking to get around a little. And so he like takes these dance classes, meet these women. He also was really into art and that sort of thing. And so he actually drops into a calligraphy class that became extremely influential to him. He really, really appreciated the beauty and the art behind the art of calligraphy. And he's given this now famous Stanford commencement speech where he really credits that class with the fact that, I'm able to type on my laptop in different fonts. Like before this, you didn't have different fonts. If it hadn't been for Steve Jobs putting this on the early Mac computers, there wouldn't have necessarily been different fonts at this point. And it's really funny in the commencement speech he gives, he says something along the lines of, if it weren't for this calligraphy class, I would have never put different fonts on any of the original Apple computers. And since Microsoft just copied everything that I did, there wouldn't have been different fonts. So he really enjoyed this setup at Reed, but he was also pretty much homeless. He rented a garage or something like that.
Yeah, no heat. But I guess maybe, this is Portland. I mean, it gets cool in the winter.
It gets real cold.
It's not Ohio cold, but
I don't know. It's pretty cold.
It's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's like 40,
they get
45 degrees.
They get winter.
Not too much snow, though.
So he was collecting bottles and like turning them in for money, or like every once in a while he would go and like maintain the psychology department's electronics and that sort of thing for money. But this was not a great existence for Steve Jobs. And so
but it was the path to success.
Yeah, and it really was. And so he continues to audit these classes for a while, but then after, a total of 18 months, I believe, is how long he spent at Reed.
After absorbing enough information.
Right. He decided that he was going to move back home with his parents and start looking for a job. But that is actually where we're going to stop for today. We will pick up in part 2, starting with his return to Silicon Valley, and we will go forward from there. So for now, we would just say thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you next week.
Hey, before we take off, I just want to remind you guys how you can support the show. First, you can rate, review, and tell a friend, and also follow us on social media.
Especially Twitter. We're at the Life of X Podcast. Additionally, you can head over to lifeofxpodcast.com/support, where you will find portals to audible.com, amazon.com, and patreon.com. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Audible is a gigantic and wonderful audiobook website. You can receive a free audiobook when you sign up through our website. You go through our Amazon portal. Any purchases that you make, Amazon kicks us a small percentage of that. And finally, you can head over to our Patreon page where you can sign up to make a contribution to the show on a per episode basis. We appreciate your support. Thank you.